Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art and sometimes the mess of software that lasts. We talk to seasoned practitioners who have wrestled with technical debt, untangled legacy code, and help teams build sustainable, resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we're joined by Chris Salvato, Senior Staff Engineer at Shopify. He's developed a framework to help ICs step into existing teams, quickly learn complex systems, and focusing on what really matters. We'll talk about navigating legacy code, identifying high-impact areas, and setting yourself up for success. Chris joins us from Colorado in the United States. Chris Salvato, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me, Robbie.
So given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Yeah, so the things that I find really important, the principles that guide me are like a well-defined, really consistent domain model, that there's a really strong set of conventions in the code base and in the system, that there's a clear vision for its future, like where is this going? What is the responsibility of this software? What responsibilities it's going to take on? And that there's nothing extraneous. So well-maintained software really shouldn't have any fat. All of that fat should be trimmed out so that it's lean, easy to maintain, easy to understand, easy to read. And now easy for LLMs to use and get context on very quickly.
Tell me more about, you talk about LLM as AI-related things, I'm assuming there. Just make sure I'm asking the dumb questions there.
Yeah, for sure. And by LLMs, I mean AI-related, like chatbots, where you can feed it a bunch of context and then have it help you with code or bug fixes and things like that.
So how are you thinking about that? Can you maybe give me like a tangible example of like how you're trimming down the fat, you're making things? Aren't computers supposed to be able to understand a lot of really complex things? So how dumbed down or simple do we need to make it for a computer to understand this better than human brains can?
Yeah, well, in the context of today's LLMs, and things are changing really, really rapidly, so this might be outdated within a month or two. But in the context of today's LLMs, most of the models, particularly the ones that are really good at coding, like Claude, now Grok 3 was just released yesterday, their context window is relatively small. So by the context window, it's how much you could actually feed into the LLM for it to understand and read and parse. So if you have lots of very, very big files that have lots of context and lots of complicated relationships that are maybe not used, the LLM will read that. It might only read a portion of that context depending on what you're working on and not understand the full picture. Whereas if you have a smaller code base, it could absorb more of that in the context window if you're using a tool like Claude or Klein. No, excuse me, not Claude, like Cursor or Klein to feed that in. And so the smaller the code base is, the better it fits into that context window so it could have a better picture of everything that's going on.
And is something that, I know that you work at Shopify, are you actively trying to think about how as an organization that you can take advantage of these? It sounds like that's the case. And so is that to help primarily with maybe more on code maintenance or just code generation or all of the above?
Well, right now, I think most places, most larger tech companies, most tech companies in general, are all figuring out how AI works. So I think it's all of the above. To go back, it's all of the above, that we're trying to figure out the best ways to do greenfield projects with AI, which it does really, really well, again, because it can have the whole context of what you're doing immediately present. But then on top of that, for Shopify, for example, there's lots of legacy code systems that are, 10, 15, 20 years old even. And they've grown and they interact with each other in different ways. And so we're also trying to figure out, I think as an industry overall, how could we use LLMs and AI for these much larger code bases where there's a lot more context? Because these LLMs do very well, like I said, where there's not a lot of context.
I can appreciate that. I know it's a moving target at the moment. We're all trying to wrap our head around it in the industry. You talked about, it's particularly legacy code, and, many developers will at some point encounter or inherit an older code base that has grown maybe messy over time or has grown and evolved and maybe have some weeds in there. I'm assuming you have quite a bit of experience with that. And doing a little bit of preparation for this conversation, I know that you kind of have developed a little bit of like a framework or an approach to how you come in and handle these situations. So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that and then how you kind of approach that nowadays?
Yeah, so let's take it from the top. My experience in the industry, I've been programming since I'm 14 years old. And then I really didn't actually start.
And you're 18 now, right?
Yeah, now I'm 18. So it's been a solid 4 years. So it's been, just for context, what does that make? It's like 26 years now that I've been coding. Obviously those early years, like most people, it's not it's not production ready code or anything like that. But for the past 15 years, I've been focusing on Ruby on Rails apps. Those apps start to get older. And most of my experience has actually been in smaller startups. So Shopify, when I joined Shopify, they were the largest company I'd worked at in a software leadership role. And so in joining Shopify, one thing that became really clear when I joined Shopify is that there's lots of legacy code systems. It's one of the oldest Rails apps in the world. There are commits that I still see in our code base in the billing system, for example, that still have Toby's name on it. So Toby's the founder and CEO of Shopify, in case you're not aware. And he started writing in 2000, writing the billing system anyway, in about 2005. So there's really, really old code there. And obviously paradigms shifted over time. And so in that experience, when I joined the team, there were a lot of things that, let me see, what's the right way to put this? When I joined the team, there was a lot of opportunity in the code and in the software to really refine what that should do and to really increase the developer productivity and the developer experience and the developer happiness right within that one system, that one billing system. And that billing system interacts with other systems. So if you make that system better, it actually has a lot of downstream impacts for the whole rest of the company. So in my time there, what I've done is kind of identified the steps that I've taken to simplify that system and make it really a developer's paradise within that one system, and that has ripple effects outwards. And so I put together a framework for myself that I share with other people at Shopify and other people that come to me for mentorship outside of Shopify on just how to go into a legacy code system and really understand it, focus on the most important things, trim out all that fat, all that extraneous stuff, so that way everybody can be more productive and the system can be a whole lot better. And I'm happy to get into that with you, but I'll let you just drive where we go from here.
Yeah, definitely want to dig into that. How do you think of what a developer paradise might look or feel like? Is that something on a macro level or on a day-to-day level? Like, what might that look like or feel like?
So when we talk about what a developer's day looks like ideally and what it looks like normally, I think at many companies there's a pretty huge delta. What I mean by that is when at most companies, a developer will show up to work. They'll do whatever they need to do to just get in and like resolve tickets and start closing tickets and work with their product manager or their engineering manager to understand what needs to get done. They get into it and then they just kind of muddle through and do whatever is necessary to just get the thing shipped. Whereas in a developer's paradise, when you have a system that is very easy to understand, you're not muddling through anything. It's very easy to understand how the pieces fit together. It's very easy to understand where things go. It's very easy to understand where you should go and where you should drive the system. And all of your tooling and everything that's set up is optimized for you to learn everything just in time. So you don't need to read tons of documentation or anything like that. Everything is pretty straightforward and it's right in the code. So you don't really need very much documentation at all. And so when you are able to strip away documentation and you have really good tooling to just know what's going on, that makes the development experience so much more enjoyable because you could just be in the code solving problems and doing what you love doing as a programmer, which is writing code to solve problems and do cool stuff.
You know, one of the toughest parts of working with a team is staying organized, especially when you're all sharing the same inbox. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Jelly is the best way for a team to share an email inbox. Whether it's for customer support, community organizing, or even managing banned emails, Jelly helps your team work together better without the hefty price tag of other tools. With Jelly, your team can collaborate on conversations with customers, users, and community members all in one place. No more stepping on toes or sending double replies. The I got this feature makes it clear who's taking the lead, and private inline comments and app mentions let the whole team contribute when necessary. You can even start conversations directly in Jelly, so everyone stays in the loop from the start. And here's the best part. Jelly's affordable plans are priced per team, not per seat. That means no extra cost as your team grows. Jelly gives you everything you need in a shared inbox. Without the clutter, you don't. Find out more at letsjelly.com and use the code maintainable for 20% off your first year. That's letsjelly.com, letsjelly.com. Try Jelly today, the shared inbox your team deserves. All right, let's get back to the show. I'm wondering how many people listening, myself maybe included, I'm like wondering, like, have I ever actually felt like I've been in a developer's paradise? Or is it feeling like you mentioned maybe some tangible examples there. And I'm thinking, like, it feels like a subjective thing. Cause I think some people are like, well, there's like, you get rid of all the clutter or distractions and I can just focus on the code. And do you often think about, like, maybe we're thinking maybe too granular on a day, like on an individual day basis, because I'm assuming maybe developers aren't feeling like it might be dependent on the type of environment that you're working in. Some people are like, I would really like to work on features and I get to spend like a week or two just focused on building features. And I know how I'm approaching this stuff and I'm not like putting out little fires. And there's definitely other people that are having to be a bit more reactive to things that are popping up day in and day out. And that's a different sort of paradise or someone else's nightmare. So where do you kind of fall into that? Are you more in the like spend quite a bit of time, space, architecting type of thing? Or do you enjoy like putting out and solving a lot of in context switching type problem solving programming?
Me personally, I like to go wherever the need is most important for the business or the software or the team. I like to focus on that rather than sometimes that leads me to architecture. Sometimes that leads me to getting really deep into the code. So I have a bit of flexibility and adaptability there. When we talk about developers' paradise, I think a very tangible example to maybe illuminate it is that back in 2010, I started messing around with different payment processing softwares, APIs and solutions. So I opened up the PayPal API, which was like the main one that you would use at the time. And it was an absolute nightmare. And why was it a nightmare? The system was very complicated. The domain model was not well defined. If you don't know anything about finance, you're reading this, you're like, how do I just collect the money? Where do things happen here? The documentation was like 1,000 pages long. And I think it was like a PDF. And then if you look at And at that same time, this was just about the time that Stripe was being founded and getting traction in Steam. So I popped open the Stripe API and it's like, wow, look at this. All the documentation is really clear. As I'm going through the documentation, I'm learning about the finance domain. I'm learning about payments. I'm learning all the different pieces that come together that I need to know and understand. This API is actually leveling me up as a person. And all of the tooling, the API responses, the errors, the client gem that they had created in Ruby, it just made everything really, really clear. And so when I think about a developer's paradise, that's a very tangible example for me. And to your earlier question, is this about architecture or is this about solving nitty-gritty problems or things like that? It's kind of all of those things. You have to look at it holistically because Stripe didn't look at just the nitty-gritty problems of the API and how it should work. That was one part of it. But they also looked at the API documentation and how the documentation fits into that. How the client gem can make it so that you don't need to reference the documentation too much because the objects just make sense. It's like, okay, there's a payment object and there's a create method. Well, I think I know how to create a payment here.
That's a really good tangible example as well. I'm thinking about documentation, and that's such a good opportunity for organizations to, one, teach people about the domain, but then also to learning. And like that, I'm having flashbacks to getting Word documents, API docs from old payment systems we used to have to integrate with back in the day. We can go down a long path with that, but we'll move on from that. But I wanted to circle back to you were talking about your framework. So when you're mentoring other people or people come to you for advice within Shopify or outside, when you come into this existing code base or area of the application, and tell us about this framework that you've been working on.
A lot of engineers go into situations where they focus on the code explicitly. So one common thing that I see when people come to me for this kind of advice is they try to learn and grok the entire code base. And now when you join a company like Shopify, you just have to accept that that's going to be impossible. You might be able to grok that one system, but it's going to take a lot of work. And by that one system, let's say you're coming into, I don't know, the domains and themes team at Shopify, right? You might be able to understand the domains and themes software really, really well, but that's going to take time as well. And so my understanding of how most people approach this is they try to understand the software system first, and I take a completely different approach. I try to understand all of the people that are in the process first. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a team of 20 people or 30 people that actively work on this software. Then you also have the engineering managers that are responsible for these people, for their growth, their development, and also bear some responsibility on the architecture of the system and how it fits into the bigger picture. Then you have their engineering managers or their directors that also have a stake in where this is going. And then you also have the VPs or CTO, depending on the size of the company, right? So you have all these people up the chain on just the engineering side that as you get further away, like concentric circles outwards, they still care about it, but they have way less context. But they still have an understanding of what they want out of this system. And if you go from the engineering side to the product side or to the business side, you have a whole list of stakeholders there that all care about what this system is going to do and how it's going to produce something in the universe, in the market. And so where most engineers join these teams, they try to pop open all the files. They try to see maybe how the models and the controllers or the view, like how all these things come together. And, oh, which systems do I need to learn more about? I actually recommend putting that off to the very, very end of the process. And I'll get into when and why that becomes more relevant. But we've identified that there's a lot of people that care about this. So how do you get an understanding of what they care about and why? The way that I go about this, I set up one-on-ones with every single person, even if it's 50 people. 50 people would be 50 hours. It sounds like a lot, but in 2 weeks, you can get through 50 people and just go through with them. What is it that you specifically, what is the biggest problems in our, for example, domains and themes software? What's the biggest opportunities? What do you think does really, really well? Where would you like to see the software go? What are some opportunities in the market that maybe I'm not aware of right now? And by asking everyone up and down the chain, from the ICs that are in the code all the way up to the VP on the engineering side, as well as the product side, you'll get a really, really good picture of what everybody expects of this. And what I do is I keep all of this raw context. I just let the conversation go whichever way it wants to, get all of this raw context, keep it in a set of documents. And then after I've done all of those interviews, I synthesize it down. Now, today you could just take all of that text and put it into an LLM and say like, hey, pick out some themes from this. When I was doing this at Shopify, the first time that didn't exist. So you could just read through and just let yourself synthesize it and just sit with it and let it incubate for a little bit. So that's step one, to just understand, what should this system do? What is it doing well now? What are the opportunities for it to do better? And with that understanding, we can go on to the next step. But I'll stop there, see if you have any questions.
Maybe people listening be like, wow, 50 meetings, but then it's all contextual based off of the size of the organization or the teams you're working on. And so if you're working on a team of 5 to 10 people, that doesn't seem insurmountable. I suppose, some people might be listening, and I know that I've gone into situations myself in consulting capacity where those conversations might happen as a group conversation. And I'm curious about the distinction between maybe doing that in one-on-one versus maybe in a group setting. Do you have by the individual approach? I don't want to make any assumptions.
The way I approach it at the very beginning is to use one-on-ones, because one-on-ones are a specific tool and group meetings are a specific tool. Where one-on-ones really shine, particularly when you're new to a system and a team, is that people will be a lot more unfiltered in one-on-ones and there's nowhere to hide. Let's say that you just joined a team. Let's say there's 50 people on it. And you say, okay, I want to conserve my time. So I'm going to only do a meeting with groups of 10 people. So I'm only going to do 5 meetings. Well, you're going to have 8 of those people on the call say absolutely nothing. And you're not going to build any trust with them. You're not going to make them feel heard. You're not going to make them feel like you understand their unique perspective on the situation. So when you're just getting started, I find that one-on-ones are really, really important, even if it's 100 people. If it's 100 people, you're talking maybe a month and a half of consistent a few meetings a day. But if you just joined a team, you don't have anything else to do. If you're a leader, you should be joining a team to understand these problems. If you're joining as an IC who's just been hired to work on it, maybe it takes you a little bit longer, but I do think you should prioritize meeting with every single person that works on and cares about this software one-on-one to get that broader context. And the reason why one-on-one is so important, like I said, is it really builds trust and that relationship, and you have to speak in a one-on-one. You can't sit there quietly. Now, later on in the process, after you get all of this context and information, then you can transition to group meetings to save some time. When you synthesize and say, okay, based off of these 100 conversations or 10 conversations, however many conversations, I've identified what I think are the top 5 to 10 problems or 5 to 10 opportunities that we could really pursue in this software system. Then you get together and you present that, and you can gather feedback from a group, and you could encourage even the people within that meeting to talk to each other about it. Like, oh, I don't think that's actually an opportunity, or, well, it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. That's where that tool is a lot more useful. But in those early days, you really want to build trust, in my opinion.
Thanks for kind of digging into that. All right, so continue down the path here. I'm on board with this idea.
Okay, cool. So once you have that broader context and you've synthesized it and you've thought about it for a little bit, that's when you document it as a list of opportunities or problems to be solved, right? And now this is going to be very, very particular to the system that you're working in. For example, it could be going back to the extraneous problem, guiding by those principles earlier that I believe well-maintained software has nothing extraneous. Maybe you've identified one of those problems is, hey, there's a lot of extraneous stuff in this software, And that's leading to people being confused. So on those one-on-ones, it could be, well, it took me 7 months to understand the software well enough where I could actually feel like I was productive every day. Well, why is that? You do some root cause analysis. You ask 5 whys. Why is it that it took you 7 months? Why didn't you understand this particular bit of software? Oftentimes, this leads you down the path of, well, the domain model isn't very clear. It's unclear how the different systems and parts of the software work together, right? So when you identify that, let's say one of those things on that list, one of those root causes is, well, there's just lots of extraneous stuff. I don't know how this stuff connects together. You compile a list of no more than 5 to 10. When I've done this, it's been about 5 or 6 usually opportunities that are the biggest opportunities. And you present that to all of the different people in smaller groups. So groups of 5 to 10 people. I usually like to do this based off of seniority. So let's say you're at a larger organization and there's 50 people. Maybe you start with your staff engineers or your principal developers, some people that are at the higher level to get their understanding, and then propagate it down and make sure you're not missing anything by talking to people who are maybe more junior or more senior, just so that they have the same exposure and you get more feedback, because often you get great feedback from those levels. But this is the synthesis and presentation phase, which that presentation phase, you're still gathering feedback and you're making sure that you're missing the mark, but you're kind of zooming in on the problems that need to be focused on. Now, at this point, you might not even know all of the systems and software subsystems within the software that you have ownership of. And that's okay, because you know what problems exist there, and you can learn those systems later. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions on that, Robbie?
A little bit thinking around. So if you get some alignment with people, and then it's just, I think, a matter for me to try to connect all right, well, how do we then, if you've got 50 developers, like, we're going to start moving in this direction. And I feel like you can talk about, these are the things we're going to start doing, but like, how do you start demonstrating that and actually turn that into tangible? Like, we're all going to start steering in this direction. Like,
yeah, so we're actually not there yet. So I like to think in 2 different phases. There's a problem phase, and you have to sit in that problem phase and that problem space really, really well, because you need to be sure that you're going to ask the right questions. And so you need to make sure you have a really well-defined understanding of the problem. So at this stage, we're not at all in solution space. I'm not saying what the solution actually is. I'm saying this is what I think the 5 problems exist are, and these are opportunities if we can solve them. This presentation phase is to make sure that everybody's aligned, that these are actually the big things. And when people start to go down, because engineers love to go down the path of like, oh, well, what if we do this? Or
as my brain started to immediately do it, right? I'm just like, okay, well, what do we do about it? And you're like, wait, let's sit in this.
Exactly. This is definitely a point where, as the person that's driving this, you want to keep pulling people out of problem space, keep them in, pull out of solution space, keep them in problem space and say, hey, we're not solving the problem right now. I just want to know, is this the problem worth solving? Because there's lots of problems out there, but are these the most important ones? So in this presentation phase, it's like, hey, I want to make sure I'm actually hitting the mark. Are these the right problems? Then later on, we're going to transition into, okay, out of these 5 or 6 of them, what are the 2 to 3 that we could focus on right now as our absolute top priority? Because even if you have 50 engineers, you're only going to really be able to focus on 1 or 2 things that are absolute top priority. And then there's going to be all this other stuff that comes from all over the organization or the market or customer support that needs to be handled and dealt with. There's a reason why your team is 5 people, 10 people, 50 people, because they got stuff they already have to work on. So you have to find the 1 or 2 things that could really change the game. And this is what that exercise is all about, is understanding the people, building the trust, understanding the expectations of the software system, and then understanding the problems that exist in the software system so you can identify that really 1 or 2 pivotal opportunity to change things. And while this really is relevant to people who step into like leadership positions to own a piece of software, if you are a junior engineer or a senior developer who just joined the team, maybe a little earlier in your career, and you start doing this, you're going to stand out immediately. It's like, wow, okay, this person is thinking from a completely different level. So if you are listening to this and thinking like, oh, okay, well, maybe like this is something I should have my lead do, or my higher ranking, or my CTO, or whatever the person that's above you in the organization. No, this is something that you can do right now while you're actually coding and developing software, and it will immediately make you stand out. Even if you just do everything I've said so far, stop there, because you'll have a deeper understanding of the problems and the opportunities in the space, and it's really great exercise to understand those really high leverage problems that can be solved anywhere.
We'll be back with Chris in just a moment. Hi, it's Robbie. Real quick, thanks for tuning in. Maintainable exists because of curious, thoughtful folks like you who care about building better software, and let's be honest, avoiding total chaos. If you're enjoying these conversations, pass it along. Tell a friend, leave a review, shout it from the rooftops, just, safely. And if you know someone I should be chatting with, shoot me an email, robbie@maintainable.fm. All right, let's get back to Salvato. Was that something you had found yourself doing kind of just naturally over at some point earlier in your career, or was this something that you kind of saw modeled by someone else that you worked with, or how did you kind of come to this approach?
Yeah, no, this is completely from first principles. So in my career, I started my career actually in sales. So I was doing sales and marketing for brain-computer interfacing companies. And in that experience, I realized that while sales was good and it was something that I was good at, I realized that I really wanted to build. So I started just building companies on the side. And so in building those companies on the side, that also led to me joining early stage startups where you have to really solve these problems from first principles. And when I went from these smaller companies where I was a founder or an early employee, you really have to focus on the most important thing to work on at any given point in time. Then when you join a larger company like Shopify or any other company that has, let's say, even more than 150 people, most likely, you could see that focus on what's most important gets diluted. So this is a process that I've instituted first when I joined Shopify, because I'm like, hey, I just need to understand what the biggest problems are, because that's what I'm used to. I'm used to trying to solve what the most important problem is. But after that, I've done this process multiple times at Shopify, and I've helped other people use it on their teams at Shopify, and also just other people on my network that come to me for mentorship and help. And I've found that it really, really works because there's this focus on what the most, the one thing, right? That focus from that book is like, what is the one thing that's really, really important? So this whole process was just developed from first principles on how I can get to understand what that one thing is for this group, for this team, for this software. Does that make sense?
Well, you mentioned a book there for all of our listeners that might not be familiar.
It's called The One Thing. It's by Gary Keller. And it came out, I think, about 10 or 15 years ago now. And the key insight here, as you can tell from the title, is like just finding the one thing and focusing on that with pretty much laser focus. So clearing away everything else that is not necessary for that, making that the one thing. You might have other things that you need to work on, but focus on that one thing and how are you going to make progress on that? And now in my process, if I don't know what that one thing is, well, what the hell am I focusing on? So you have to identify that first. And so this is the way that I've put together to get to that understanding.
Interesting. I'm going to have to check that book out as well. As a business owner, sometimes it's hard to know what the one thing I should be focusing on when there's a lot of things happening. And there's different people. I would imagine that the one thing that everybody might be different depending on your role in the organization and such. So we can move on from that. But all right, so we're come back to your framework and your approach here. We're sitting in the problem. How long approximately does that sort of time lasts, and what are people doing now that you all kind of agree that these are the 5 or 6 challenges that we're all saying these are problems that are we thinking about them? Are we talking about them? Are we splitting those up? Or are we focusing on a couple of them? Tell me more.
So in this process so far, we've talked to everybody who has an opinion on this, who holds a stake in this. And then we've synthesized that down to a list of problems that we think are important. We don't know which ones are the most important ones yet. Then we talk with the team, we present them, and we try to say what's the most important one here? Which ones really need to be solved right now? Then that kind of shortlists 1 or 2 of them. Now we start to transition from, we understand the problem. What is the right question we need to ask for these 1 or 2 problems that are on the list? How can we phrase this question so that it will lead us to solving the problem, and we could invert it? How would we fail at this, right? How would we fail at solving this problem? Let's just not do that. So getting into this question phase and distilling it down to a question, that's the last step in the problem definition phase. Then we move on to actually how we're going to solve it. That coming to that question after you have the list of problems is a very similar process of just repeating what you've just done. You might even be able to do it as you're having those group meetings and you're just synthesizing it into one question. But if you need to have another meeting or two, I recommend doing this with your more senior level staff. So staff plus engineers or your senior engineers, whoever the most senior people are on the team, to just say, okay, like I just want to be sure I'm asking the right question here.
Through this process, are you documenting this in somewhere where then you can keep revising this topic? Is there's like a living document somewhere you're continually revising, or is this how are you just capturing the questions and reframing the problem and then just sharing that with your teammates?
Yeah. So up until now, it's been mostly conversational. As people who work closely with me, they know I hate documents, like with a passion. I really don't like Google Docs or anything like that. So the way that I approach it is everything is in my own unstructured notes until I get to the problem synthesis phase, where I'm creating that list of problems. That list of problems is a document technically, but it's like a bullet point list of these are, let's say, the 5 problems, and maybe a short description that's a paragraph or so on just, okay, this is the problem statement, and then this is a little bit more context on the problem. So let's say, for example, a very common issue in larger software companies is like, okay, we have this software that has a lot of different responsibilities because every time something new came up, we just tacked something else onto the software, right? But we didn't actually think about what is the domain model of this software or anything like that. So we wind up in a situation where this software kind of does everything, and there's all these different God objects and stuff like that. And so that might come through in your feedback and through your information gathering phase of, well, this system is really difficult to work with. Well, why? Because this system doesn't interact with that system very effectively or whatever. And then you can say, okay, well, the problem is that people can't work very effectively in this software. It takes months to ship even the most trivial features. Okay, so you that's the problem statement. Let's say that's your highest leverage one. Then you ask the question, how can we make it so that people could ship features faster and make the software more intuitive, maintaining the software more intuitive? And if you start with that question, then this is where engineers really shine. Now you go into another phase where you pose this question. You've got it documented. It's very lightweight documentation. This could be meetings or it could be asynchronous messages. Like, this is the question we need to answer. Can you guys dump ideas here? And engineers love this kind of thing because it's a very well-defined question, and you can start to really get and ideate different ideas. Now, we're not in decision mode yet. This is in a mode where we're gathering as many ideas as possible on how we can do this.
Would that be an in-person freeform brainstorming type session, or would that be something you're doing a little bit asynchronous or a bit of both?
I think when you're getting started, you should have as much face time as possible if you're in a leadership position. If you are not in a leadership position, maybe it makes more sense to do this asynchronously with just like a chat, a message in a Slack channel or a Teams channel or something like that. But there are lots of different freeform ways to gather this information, like where, everybody loads up a Figma or a FigJam or some kind of whiteboarding tool like Miro, and you just have sticky notes on like, okay, here's the big question, and everybody lists out their solutions. That could be better because sometimes if there's a Slack thread with even 10 replies, people are disincentivized from getting answers. So there's lots of different, if you ask an AI assistant or Google or whatever for ideas on how to gather context information, there's lots of different facilitation techniques for that. So there's no shortage of different ideas there, and like employ as many as possible to just get as many different ideas as possible. Me, I'm pretty lightweight. I would usually ask in a Slack thread or in a Slack thread in series of Slack threads that are in different areas where there's only like 5 or 10 people that would participate them in any given time. Again, so that way people don't feel like the conversation ran away from them. That's what I prefer, but I've also done other approaches as well, which could be really efficient and fun for the team as well.
Yeah, I was just curious because I know that, in kind of going back to that, you can't hide, or sometimes I've been in brainstorming sessions where you can be like, well, let's not prejudge or make decisions or counter things. And some people might be afraid to toss up an idea because someone might be like, well, that's not going to work. We tried that before. Like those sorts of like little things that happen in those sorts of scenarios. So I think you have some good approaches there. All right, continue.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good, Robbie. So once you have your question, and once this is now the point where you're gathering all of the different information or different ideas on how we can actually tackle this problem. In my opinion, one of the great features of this approach is that I'm actually not doing anything. So when you turn around and you say like, oh, okay, we need to improve the developer experience so that the software is more intuitive. And somebody else came up with the idea of like, well, I don't know where all the different objects are. It's like, well, what if we defined our domain model a lot more clearly and we knew what should be in the system versus not be in the system? Because this is all happening organically and it's happening from people at all different levels up and down the chain over the course of a little bit of time, like maybe a month or two, everybody feels like they're making this decision. So first off, I only have to really bring my judgment. Yes, I have to bring ideas to the table too. I'm part of this process, but I'm one voice of many other voices. And so when it comes down to like, okay, we've all decided together that there are these kinds of ones bubbled to the top, and these are the ideas for how we could solve it. Well, what do you guys think about executing on that? Well, some people whose ideas were not the ones that were decided on, maybe they feel like, oh, well, I wish my ideas were the ones we were working on, but they feel heard and they could understand like, oh, I do see this other idea. It does have merit. It's a hard decision to decide which one is more important. We have to pick which one is the most important one. It's still on the list of things that we think are important. It's been captured, and we could get to it later. What you wind up seeing is that there's a lot of buy-in very, very quickly because the whole process has been transparent. It's not like you go around and have a few meetings or like you just jump on a team and you look at the code in isolation and you look at all the systems in isolation and then say, as the leader of this team, I believe that we need to do this. They're like, well, I've been here for 10 years. Like where's my input here? So this next phase, after the ideation, you're really just picking the ones that seem like most high leverage, and you'll find that the team kind of rallies around certain ones that they feel are the most high leverage that could have the biggest impact. And then what you wind up seeing is there's almost immediate buy-in from most people, if not all people, depending on the personalities that are on your team. So that next stage is identifying the things to work on, and then convincing people like, yes, we need to work on it. And that is captured in, this is the thing that we are working on. This is the thing that we are really important. And that might be something that actually takes years to accomplish, which then, if you're doing this right, it should be something that takes years to accomplish. It shouldn't be something, there should be a list of ideas that you could do immediately, but it should all be working towards this larger goal that the team has identified.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. Software doesn't age well on its own. It slows down, it gets messy, and holds teams back. At Planet Argon, we help organizations clean up legacy code, reduce technical debt, and modernize their web applications. Whether you need extra hands or just the right expertise, we're here to help. We specialize in Ruby on Rails, React, Laravel, and more. So if your software is stuck in the past, send them our way. Visit planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, back to the show. When you're talking with teams about this and you're thinking about getting to that developer's paradise, if you're not there yet, and thinking, okay, well, you might be looking at a couple of years down the road, and that's good. And I think a lot of people listening might be thinking, well, I'm just trying to think about the next few months, or how do I make things better in the next six months for myself? Or if we don't figure this stuff out in the next year or two, I'm going to go look for another job at some point because this seems untenable for me in my career. If I'm going to have to live in this maybe non-developer paradise world. So thinking about, anyone that's listening could take advantage of this sort of approach and start doing this. And I would imagine, when I talk to a lot of developers, I always feel like they already have ideas for things that they want to do. And so they feel like they're trying to find ways to sell that idea. But I think what you're advocating for is more of let's take a couple steps back. Let's talk about the challenges we're having and find a more communal approach to coming up with new ideas. And maybe your idea is not actually the best idea, because I think there's that wisdom that comes over a period of time. I feel like the more I talk with people that have been around longer in the industry, have a lot less definitive opinions about how things should be done, and they're like, well, actually, it's probably a lot more. Where early in your career you get this kind of point where it feels like a lot of people will be like become super opinionated because they feel like they know enough, developing their opinions, and then over time those opinions start to kind of maybe fade a little bit in some ways. Maybe they're not as strongly convinced about certain patterns or architectural decisions. But so speak to them a little bit. Like, what sort of advice would you advocate for if like they have some specific things that they're dealing with on a day in and day out basis? They want to sell stakeholders or their teammates on moving in this direction, but talk to them.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things, like what you mentioned, is they want to sell their ideas to the other people that they're working with. One of the things that's kind of embedded in this process that I've developed is really getting an understanding of the principles that are driving this particular system. And those principles that are driving this particular system or this particular company are going to be different to the last company you were at, or what you learned in school, or what you learned in however you learned, what you decided on your own, or that article that you read. And in my experience in the industry and in life is that principles and values are incredibly important to identify and understand. So embedded in this, you're going through that whole process. You're talking to VPs, you're talking to, if your company is small, if you might even be talking to the CEO, the CTO, the senior developers, you're understanding what their perspective is. And that perspective is going to highlight the principles and the values that are important to them in the software, in the business, and in their own personal life. In understanding those people and understanding those principles and those ideals, that's where you could actually start to sell. So Jordan Belfort in Wolf of Wall Street, right? He has that famous thing where it's like, okay, sell me this pen, right? And so a lot of people will start to, when you talk about selling a pen, a lot of people start to talk about like, oh, these are the features of the pen, and it writes really well, and it rolls very quickly, and things like that. But when you're actually selling, this is where my sales experience comes in handy from being a salesperson for about 5 years, is that it doesn't actually matter what you want or what you care about or what your principles are. What matters are the principles of the people around you and the people that are going to make decisions. What do they care about? And then you have to align what you care about and what they care about, align your principles, align your values. And once you do that, you're not actually selling, you're just communicating. And then you tell them, or they're even telling you, and it's a much easier sell in that case. You mentioned people at these companies or engineers that are in these positions where it's like, oh, maybe I'm not even going to be here. Like if we're setting something for like 3 years from now, I think the average tenure at a tech company is like 2 years or something like that. So like, why would I set a direction for a company for 5 years or 10 years if I'm not going to be there? And the reason is that's actually, in my opinion, that's what separates really top performing engineers from people that are just looking at what they're going to be able to do to get what they want out of the company. It's really an exercise in aligning what the company needs. The company needs something that's going to think beyond your tenure. That's what the company needs. But then during your tenure, there's a lot that you can do to advance your own goals. Maybe it's to learn more about navigating a big company, or maybe it's more about learning a particular technology or becoming a really great Rails developer or something like that. And that's where you need to know what your principles, values, and goals are, and what the company's values and goals are, and align them as best as you can. So that whole early part of the process, when you're just joining a company, is like extracting as much about all the different values and principles of the company so that you could align yourself much better. And when you set that direction, you're going to stand out. You're going to do exceptionally well. You're going to create inflection points for the business, for your team. It's going to be very, very rewarding experience for you, but you might not be around to experience the whole thing.
Listeners, I hope you might want to go back and re-listen to that a little bit. This is important stuff to think about. And as Chris mentions, like thinking about what the difference between top performers and how you're there to help the company and the company will help you. And there's so much to unpack here, and we only have so much time with you today, Chris. So I want to be mindful about that. But you might be one of the people that I'm like, I want to get Chris back on the show so we can continue this conversation at some point. But
one thing I do want to point out is you did mention that the approach is communal. I do want to point out that there's a lot of communal aspects to it. There's a lot of sourcing from various areas. But I do want to point out that if you're like a senior developer, you don't have a lot of agency, this is a great way to build influence in the team, and it's very communal, and you might not have decision-making power. But if you've been hired or your role, or promoted or whatever, into a role where you need to make the decisions on this, it's a communal information gathering process. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a list of 5 things. You need to pick the one of them or the 2 of them. There's going to be a list of all these different ideas on how this could be improved or go well, but you are the leader. You need to pick the one of them. So it's communal information gathering. It's communal ideation. It's making sure that you're uncovering all the rocks and everybody has a voice and everybody, you're not missing anything. It's a real truth-seeking exercise. But at the end of the day, you need to be the one that decides what direction are we actually going? And even if you're not the one that has the ultimate decision, you still need to decide and communicate up your recommendation and say, okay, we did this whole exercise. This is what I uncovered. These are the top 5 opportunities. This is the one that I think is most important. Do with that as you will. But that's my recommendation. So communal in approach, but very singular in decision making.
Well, that seems like a really good point in the conversation to put a bow on it. I hope everybody can definitely spend some time thinking about this and how they can apply some of this today. All right, Chris, with a couple of quick wrap-up questions for you. Is there a non-software, non-tech book that you find yourself recommending to people aside from the book you mentioned earlier, The One Thing?
Yeah, so a non-software book, and I read a lot of biographies. Some people like biographies, some don't. I like them because they're like stories, and it's kind of like unfurling this whole lifetime of a story, and how much could I glean off of this experience of this person's life and then everything around them. And one of the best biographies that I think was really eye-opening in a lot of ways was, it's called Titan. I can't remember who the author is, but it's a story of John D. Rockefeller. And why this is a really interesting story is that John D. Rockefeller had a very, very interesting life, and he's been a very, very controversial figure. He's kind of like the Elon Musk of our times, but back in the 1800s. And it's an incredibly long book, so it's a really good audiobook listen, and pop it on in the car, and you kind of just take this guy's life chapter by chapter. But there's lots of really good leadership lessons and leadership observations from a time before software existed, but a lot of the principles still apply today if you could look into his life and see how he approached different things, but also see how they were perceived by the world on the outside, and maybe some of the mistakes he made, even though he was wildly successful. So I find that biography to really, really good. I'd recommend it.
Excellent. I will add that to my own list because I've been getting into a kick of reading biographies in the last 2 years or so, and so I hadn't even considered going back into.
Yeah, they're a great. I mean, there's Ben Franklin, Steve Jobs. There's the early Elon Musk one from Elon Vance. There's a new Walter Isaacson Elon Musk one. There's so many great biographies. Yeah,
I appreciate that. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
Yeah, so I don't have too much of an online presence at the moment, but you can find me on Twitter, which is @Salvato Chris. So feel free to send me a DM or to tag me or anything with any questions on anything you have here, and I'll be happy to respond there right out in the open in public.
Well, I really appreciate that. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Chris. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me, Robbie. Let's chat again sometime.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.